Your grandmother forgot your name. She forgot your face, and the year, and the house you grew up in, and eventually that you existed at all. Then someone put on a song from 1962, and she sang every word to you. Not a fragment, not humming, the verses, in order, with the phrasing, and her face changed while she did it. This is not a metaphor, and it is not the kind of heartwarming story families tell each other. It is a documented neurological phenomenon, studied in laboratories, visible on brain scans, and it happens because the music you carry is stored differently from almost everything else in your head. The disease that takes a person apart takes the rooms one by one, and there is a room it reaches last. In that room the lights are still on, and there is music playing, and it will be playing after everything else has gone dark. The real neuroscience does not tell you that music is magic, or that it heals the brain, and anyone selling that is selling something. It tells you something stranger and considerably more specific, that a song is not stored the way a fact is stored. A name lives in one system, a phone number lives in another, but a song you learned at 17 is written across your motor system, your emotional system, your autobiographical memory, and your auditory cortex simultaneously, in a distributed pattern that a disease has to demolish several separate regions to erase. And one of the areas most involved in musical memory happens to be among the last regions damaged in the most common form of dementia. That is not poetry, that is anatomy, and it explains something families witness every day and are never given an explanation for. Keep the image of the house beside you all night, because everything returns to it. A person is a building with a great many rooms, and this illness does not knock the building down. It goes through it, room by room, in a sequence that is remarkably consistent from patient to patient, turning out the lights. The room holding this morning goes very early. The rooms holding recent decades go next. Childhood holds on longer, and somewhere near the back, in a part of the house nobody thought to map until recently, there is a room the fire reaches late, and what is kept in there is music. Families who have sat through this describe exactly that, a person becoming steadily harder to reach, until reaching them at all seems impossible, and then a song, and something answers, not the whole person, but something that was still in there, and that had not been reachable by any other route that day. So here is what tonight will do. First, the anatomy. Why a song is built differently in your head from every other kind of memory, which systems it recruits, and what specifically the scans show when a person listens to music they have known for 50 years. Second, the strangest finding in this whole area, which is not about illness at all, but about you, right now, and concerns the fact that the music of a particular 5-year window of your life is permanently privileged over everything you have heard since. And third, what can actually be done with this, honestly stated, including where the evidence is strong and where it is being badly oversold. And one more promise, because this channel does not sell comfort it cannot support. Near the end, I will give you the strongest objections to everything you are about to hear, including the objection that stories like your grandmother's are cherry-picked, and that the science underneath them is thinner than it sounds. A word first about who is likely to be listening. Because this subject has an audience it did not choose. A substantial number of people watching anything at this hour are watching from a particular position. They have a parent, or a spouse, or a grandparent in the middle of this, and they are exhausted, and they have been told a great many hopeful things by people with something to sell. So let me be clear about what tonight is and is not. There is no treatment in this video. Nothing here slows the disease, and nothing here will bring anyone back. What there is instead is an explanation of a phenomenon you may already have witnessed and not understood, and, near the end, an honest account of what can and cannot be done with it. If you are in the middle of that, the most useful thing I can tell you is that what you saw was real, that there is a reason for it, and that the reason is not sentimental. Let us take that objection now at full strength, because it deserves to be first rather than buried. It goes like this. Everyone has seen the video. An elderly man in a wheelchair, unresponsive, headphones go on, and his face lights up. Those videos are moving, and they are also selected. For every one that circulates, there are many where nothing happens, and nobody films those. Families remember the afternoon their mother sang, and forget the 200 afternoons she did not. The phenomenon may be real, and much rarer, and much less reliable than the impression created by a decade of viral footage. And a video that builds an emotional case on such material is doing something irresponsible. That objection is correct about the footage, and it is the right instinct, and I accept all of it as a warning about anecdote. Here is why the case does not rest on the footage. The claim tonight is anatomical, that musical memory is distributed differently, and that certain regions crucial to it are relatively spared in Alzheimer's disease, and that claim comes from imaging studies and from post-mortem examination of brain tissue, not from anybody's video. The anatomy is checkable whether or not any particular grandmother sings, and it is worth stating precisely what the anecdote gets wrong, because the correction matters for families. The viral videos imply a restoration. The person comes back, briefly, and is themselves again. That is not what is happening, and believing it sets people up for a particular kind of heartbreak. Nothing about the disease is reversed by a song. The damaged tissue is damaged, and the person who cannot recognize their daughter before the music still cannot recognize her during it. What the song reaches is not the whole person, but a preserved capacity, and the emotional response that follows is real, without being a return. Families who understand this are, in my reading of the accounts, both less devastated and more effective because they stop trying to retrieve the person and start using a channel that is still open. The distinction sounds subtle, and it is enormous. One is a search for someone who cannot be found. The other is a visit with someone who is still there, in a smaller way, reachable only by a particular door. Every carer I have read on this describes the same turning point, and describes it as the moment the visit stopped being unbearable, when they stopped asking, "Do you know who I am?" and started singing. So start with the anatomy, because it is the load-bearing part. In 2015, a research team at the University of Amsterdam, led by Junian Henrik Jacobsen and colleagues, set out to identify where in the brain long-term musical memory lives. They used functional imaging while participants listened to music, distinguishing between pieces that were long known, recently learned, and entirely unheard, which allowed them to isolate the regions specifically involved in recognizing music encoded long ago. The area that emerged most strongly was a region called the caudal anterior cingulate and the ventral pre-supplementary motor area, sitting in the medial frontal lobe. And then the team did something that made the finding matter enormously. They compared the location of that region against the known pattern of damage in Alzheimer's disease, using published maps of where amyloid deposits and atrophy accumulate as the illness progresses. That comparison is the part of the study that gives it force, and it is worth pausing on the method rather than rushing to the result. Anyone can observe that patients respond to music. The difficult thing is to explain why they should, given everything else that has been destroyed. The team's approach was to establish first where musical memory lives, using imaging in healthy participants where the answer can be trusted, and only then to ask what happens to that territory in the disease. That order matters. Had they started with patients, any finding would have been confounded by the damage itself. By establishing the map in intact brains and then overlaying the known pathology, they were able to make a prediction rather than an observation. This region should be relatively spared, and therefore this capacity should survive. The overlap was minimal. The regions that encode long-term musical memory were among the areas showing comparatively little of the pathology that characterizes the disease, particularly in its earlier and middle stages, which produces an explanation that is almost brutally simple, and which I want to state carefully rather than dramatically. It is not that music is protected by some special property, not a spiritual immunity, not a soul-level resilience, not anything that would justify the word magic. It is that the filing cabinet holding your songs happens to sit in a part of the building the fire reaches late. That is all. It is an accident of anatomy, and it is the reason a woman who cannot recognize her own son can produce 4 verses of a song she learned before he was born. It helps to know the shape of the damage, because the shape is what makes the survival possible. Alzheimer's disease does not attack the brain uniformly. It begins, in the great majority of cases, in a structure called the entorhinal cortex and moves quickly into the hippocampus, which is the machinery that turns present experience into lasting memory. That is why the earliest and most devastating symptom is the loss of the new. A conversation from 10 minutes ago is gone, while a wedding in 1958 stays vivid. The person is not losing their past first. They are losing their ability to make a present. From there, the damage spreads outward through temporal and parietal regions, taking language, orientation, and the recognition of faces and objects in a progression families learn to anticipate. But the spread is not random and does not arrive everywhere at once, and certain motor and medial frontal areas hold out far longer. The song lives in the part of the house furthest from where the fire starts. But location alone does not explain it, and the second half of the answer is about how a song is encoded rather than where. Consider what actually happens in you when a familiar song plays. Your auditory system processes the sound, which is the obvious part. Your motor system engages because you learnt that song by singing it or moving to it, and motor memory is famously durable. This is the same system that lets a person who has forgotten almost everything still ride a bicycle. Even people who insist they cannot sing have this. The throat prepares, the jaw shifts, the breath organizes itself around phrases you have not performed in 20 years. Your emotional systems activate because the song carries a charge. Your autobiographical memory activates because the song is bound to a time and a place and often a person. And your predictive machinery runs continuously because a familiar song is a sequence of expectations being met and violated in a pattern you know intimately. That last one is worth dwelling on because it explains an experience everyone has had and nobody questions. Listen to a song you know well and let it be interrupted a beat before a resolution, and something in you protests physically. You did not consult a memory to produce that protest. A prediction was running continuously ahead of the music, and it was violated. and the violation registered before any thought. A song is not something you retrieve, it is something you run in real time, with your whole nervous system leaning slightly into the next bar. So a song is not a file, it is a chord struck across half a dozen systems at once, and this changes what it takes to destroy it. To erase a name, a disease needs to damage one storage system. To erase a song, it would have to damage the motor pathways and the emotional circuits and the auditory associations and the predictive structures, all of which are anatomically separate and degrade at different rates. Redundancy is why the song survives, not sentiment, not the strength of the emotion attached to it. Engineering. It is stored in too many places to be deleted cleanly, and any surviving fragment of the network can pull the rest of it up, which is why hearing 3 notes can retrieve a whole song you have not thought of in 40 years. You are not remembering the song. Several different parts of you are remembering different aspects of it simultaneously, and the result assembles into what feels like a single seamless retrieval. You can test the strangeness of that on yourself right now, without any equipment. Try to recall the second verse of a song you have known for decades without singing the first. Most people cannot do it. The words will not come out of order, because they are not stored as a list, but as a sequence that has to be run. Try to say the lyrics as plain speech, without the tune, and notice how the tune insists on coming anyway, and how much harder the words are without it. Try to remember what you had for lunch 3 Thursdays ago, and then notice that a song you have not deliberately thought about since school is fully available on demand, complete, with no effort whatsoever. Something has kept it, perfectly, for decades, at no apparent cost, while discarding thousands of lunches. And you never rehearsed it. Nobody sat you down at 19 and told you to maintain that song for 50 years. There was no practice, no revision, no deliberate effort of any kind. It simply stayed, because of how it was written, while everything you did try to remember for exams has gone. That asymmetry is running in you tonight, and it is not about illness at all. It is simply what music does inside a human being. Before the next layer, hold what we have. A memory that is not stored in one place, but written across motor, emotional, autobiographical, auditory and predictive systems at once. A region critical to long-term musical memory that sits in an area the most common dementia damages comparatively late. Redundancy so extensive that partial destruction of the network still permits retrieval, and a consequence that families see and cannot explain. The words are still there when the name is gone, and nobody has ever explained to them why. There is a detail in that which is worth making explicit, because it reverses the usual assumption about what is fragile. We tend to think of music as the decorative layer of a mind, the thing you add once the serious business of facts and language is handled, and of names and dates as the solid core. The anatomy says the opposite. The names are the fragile layer. They are held in one place, retrieved by one root, and they go early and completely. The songs are the durable substrate, held everywhere, retrievable from any fragment, surviving into the final months of a life. Whatever a person is made of, at the level the disease reveals, it is not made of facts. Facts turn out to be the surface. Underneath, apparently, there is rhythm. There is a further layer, and it deepens the picture considerably. Memory researchers distinguish between declarative memory, the kind you consciously retrieve and constate, and procedural memory, the kind that lives in action and cannot easily be described. Knowing that Paris is the capital of France is declarative. Knowing how to tie a shoelace is procedural. And if you try to explain shoelace tying in words, you will discover how differently that knowledge is held. These two systems depend on different brain structures, and in Alzheimer's disease, the declarative system is devastated early, while procedural memory can remain remarkably intact well into the illness. People who cannot say what year it is can still play the piano. People who cannot recognize a spoon can still use one correctly when it is placed in their hand. The classic demonstration of this dissociation is older than any imaging study. Patients with profound amnesia were taught a difficult manual skill day after day and improved steadily at it, while insisting each morning that they had never seen the task before. Their performance carried the learning, their conscious minds carried nothing. Two systems, one intact and one destroyed, in the same person, disagreeing about whether something had happened, and a song learned by singing it is substantially procedural. You did not memorize those lyrics as a list of facts, you performed them hundreds of times in a body, with a rhythm and a breath pattern and a physical shape to the phrases, which means that retrieving them is closer to riding a bicycle than to recalling a date, and it explains a detail that families always notice and always find eerie. The person often cannot tell you about the song. Ask what it is called, who sang it, when they first heard it, and there may be nothing at all. But start the melody and the words arrive, in order, on time. The knowledge is in the doing rather than in the knowing, and the doing survives the knowing by years. The most instructive cases in this literature are the musicians. There is a well-documented case of a professional musician who suffered catastrophic damage to his memory systems following a viral infection of the brain, leaving him with an amnesia so severe that his experience reset every few seconds. He believed, continuously, that he had just woken up, and wrote the same observation in a diary hundreds of times, crossing out the previous entry each time as an error. He could not recognize anyone except his wife, could not remember any event of his life, and greeted her with enormous emotion each time she entered a room, having no sense of having seen her that morning. And he could conduct a choir, he could sit at a keyboard and play complex pieces from memory, and while he was playing, he was, by every account, coherent, purposeful, and present. When the music stopped, it stopped. That case is often told as a story about the mystery of music, and the more accurate framing is that it demonstrates the independence of memory systems with a clarity no experiment could ethically produce. One system was destroyed almost completely, another was untouched, and the one that was untouched happened to be the one holding the music. Now, a question worth asking, and the answer is not flattering to any of us. If this is anatomical, checkable, and observable in nearly every long-term care facility on Earth, why has it taken so long to be taken seriously? Part of the answer is that music was categorized, for most of the history of modern medicine, as recreation. Hospitals had music the way they had televisions, something to occupy patients between the parts of the day when medicine happened. It was not thought of as touching the mechanism of anything, and a thing that is not thought of as mechanism does not get studied by people who study mechanisms. It took decades, and a good deal of work by therapists and nurses who were watching it happen daily and being politely ignored before the imaging community turned instruments toward it. This is not a conspiracy. It is a very ordinary failure of categories, and it happens constantly. Something is filed under the wrong heading, and the filing prevents anyone from looking at it. And the evidence sits in plain view in 1,000-day rooms for 50 years. There is a second reason, and it is less comfortable. The people who noticed first were mostly not doctors. They were nurses, care assistants, music therapists, and family members, which is to say people whose observations do not, professionally speaking, count as data. A care assistant who reports that Mrs. Ellis becomes calm and lucid when a particular hymn is played is making an observation of genuine scientific interest, and the structure of medicine gives that observation almost nowhere to go. It is not a trial. It has no controls. It will not be published. And so it is repeated at handover and forgotten and made again by somebody else the following decade. When the imaging studies finally arrived, they did not discover the phenomenon. They confirmed something that thousands of people had been watching for generations and had no way to make audible. That pattern is worth remembering whenever you encounter a piece of knowledge that seems to have been discovered suspiciously late. Very often it was known all along, by people whose job description did not include knowing things, and the traditions were using this property of memory for thousands of years before anyone knew why it worked. Before writing was widespread, and long after it was, the material a culture could not afford to lose was set to melody. The Vedic tradition of India preserved enormous bodies of text across centuries by chanting, with intricate rules of pitch and accent that functioned as error correction, and the transmission is astonishingly accurate across a span in which nothing was written down. Jewish tradition developed a system of cantillation marks that govern how scripture is chanted, and children learn the melody with the text as a single thing. The Christian monastic tradition sang the Psalms, all of them, on a fixed cycle, and monks came to know them in a way that reading could never have produced. In many houses, the entire Psalter was sung through every week, for a lifetime, which means a monk of 40 had performed those texts thousands of times with his own breath. Accounts from such communities record men in extreme old age, confused about the present, joining the office without hesitation at the correct point. Islamic tradition preserves its scripture through recitation with prescribed rules of pronunciation and pacing. Homer's epics were sung before they were written, and the scholarship on how that transmission worked found that the poems are built from repeated formulaic phrases fitted to the meter, which is precisely what a memory system needs. Recurring patterns that reduce the load and give the reciter somewhere to stand while the next line assembles. Across every continent, the same discovery, made independently, that if you need a thing to survive in human beings rather than on paper, you attach it to a tune. The Vedic case is the most extreme and the most instructive, because they were not merely singing, they were engineering. The transmission required absolute accuracy across centuries, and so the tradition developed layered recitation methods in which the same text is chanted in multiple permuted orders, words paired and reversed and interleaved according to strict schemes, so that any corruption in one pattern becomes audible against the others. It is, in effect, a checksum implemented in human voices, invented long before anyone had the concept. And scholars comparing recitations from widely separated regions have found the correspondence remarkably close. Notice what that tells you about the underlying insight. They did not simply notice that melody aids memory, they understood that the musical structure could carry constraints that prose could not, and they built error correction into the chant itself. And every one of the traditions did some version of this. Rhythm, rhyme, meter, and melody are not decorations on sacred text. They are the storage medium, chosen because it was the most durable one available in a world where the only hard drive was a person. Now the break, firmly, because this is exactly where a channel could overclaim. None of those traditions knew about the anterior cingulate or the difference between declarative and procedural memory. They were not doing neuroscience, they were solving a practical problem about transmission, and they solved it by trial and error over centuries, keeping what worked. A structural parallel is not a proof, but notice what the parallel legitimately shows, which is not small. Long before anyone could explain it, human beings discovered empirically that melody makes memory durable, and they built their most important institutions on that discovery and staked the survival of their sacred texts on it. They were right. The neuroscience of the last 2 decades has now supplied the reason, and the reason is that a sung thing is written into more of a person than a spoken thing, and therefore harder to lose, which is why, at the very end of a life, when nearly everything has been taken, the songs are still there. The traditions were building for exactly this contingency. Though they thought they were building for a different one, they were solving the problem of how to carry a text across generations. They accidentally solved the problem of how to reach a person at the end of their life, which is a different problem entirely, and which nobody in those centuries could have anticipated needing. Since almost nobody lived long enough to develop the illnesses that make it necessary. And this is only the first thread, because everything so far has been about the last room, about what survives when everything else goes, and that framing makes this sound like a video about illness. It is not. The strangest finding in this field is about you, tonight, with your memory perfectly intact, because it turns out that the songs you carry are not a random selection from everything you have ever heard. They cluster with a precision that startled the researchers who first measured it in a narrow window of your life, roughly between the ages of 15 and 25, and the music of those years is permanently privileged over everything that came before or after in a way that has nothing to do with the quality of the music. You did not choose your favourite songs. They were chosen by a process that was running in you during a specific developmental period and then closed, and whatever was playing while it was open became part of the structure, which raises a question worth staying awake for. If your music was fixed by a window that has already shut, what else was? And there is a second question underneath it, which is the one that will carry the rest of the night. Why would a brain be built that way? Why should a specific stretch of adolescence and early adulthood get permanent priority over the 4 or 5 decades that follow, when a person hears far more music, with better taste and more context, in every one of those later decades? Nobody chooses this. People in their 50s are frequently embarrassed by what still moves them most, and are entirely unable to install a replacement. You cannot decide that a song you encountered last year will occupy the place held by one you heard at 19. Something was open then and is not open now. Understanding what it was open for turns out to explain not only your music, but a great deal about why the people you met in that window still occupy the positions they occupy, and why the person you were becoming during it is the person you have essentially remained. Your favourite songs were chosen for you, not by your taste, not by your judgment, not by anything you decided. They were selected by a process running inside you between roughly 15 and 25, and when your window closed, the selection was final. This is not a metaphor. It has been measured repeatedly across cultures and generations, with a regularity that unsettles the researchers who study it. Ask people of any age to rate music from across their lifetime, and the ratings spike sharply for the songs of their own adolescence. Not the best music they ever heard, not the most sophisticated, not what they would defend in an argument as objectively finest. The music that was playing while they were becoming who they are. Everything you have heard since has been competing for a place that was already taken. The effect has a name, the reminiscence bump, and it is not confined to music. Ask an older person for the vivid memories of their life, and the same shape appears, a disproportionate concentration in adolescence and early adulthood, far denser than the decades before or after. Ask for their favourite films, their formative books, the news events that feel most significant, and the bump appears again. Something about that stretch of years lays down memory differently, and whatever passes through it acquires a permanence that later material cannot obtain, no matter how good it is. It is a window, in the strict sense, open for a period, then closed, with whatever happened to be passing during the opening now permanently inside. Which means that when a person at the end of their life sings a song from 1962, they are not reaching randomly into the past. They are reaching into the densest region of everything they ever were. The evidence for the bump is unusually strong for a finding in this area, because it keeps appearing regardless of how you look for it. It shows up when people are asked for free recollections, when they are cued with words, when they are asked to name public events, and when they are asked to rate music. It shows up in different countries and in generations whose adolescences were separated by 50 years, which rules out any explanation based on the particular qualities of one era's popular culture. Studies of musical preference find the peak clustering around the early 20s, with the effect strongest for music people encountered around that age, regardless of when they were born, and it appears in a form that people find slightly humiliating. When it is pointed out, parents and children reliably reproduce the same argument about music in every generation, with each side certain that theirs is objectively better, and both of them are simply reporting the location of their own bump. The parent who says they do not make music like they used to is making a statement about their own neurology and believes it to be a statement about the industry. Their own parents said it. Their children will say it. About music that currently seems to them self-evidently inferior, and they will be equally sincere and equally wrong about what they are describing. Nobody is winning that argument. Nobody ever has, and nobody can, because it is not an argument about music. So this stretch does three things. First, why that window exists at all, what is happening in a brain between 15 and 25 that closes afterward, and why evolution would build a creature with a period of heightened permanence in the middle of it. Second, the property of music that makes it different from every other kind of memory cue, which is that it does not merely remind you of a time, it appears to reinstate the state you were in. And third, the strangest finding in this literature, which concerns what a song does to a brain in the moment of hearing it, and which explains why the effect is not simply nostalgia and is not simply pleasant. Start with the window, because it is not arbitrary. The period between roughly 15 and 25 is when a human being constructs an identity, and that is not a figure of speech. It is when a person decides or discovers what kind of person they are, what they believe, who they belong with, what they will not tolerate, what moves them, and crucially, it is when they do this for the first time, and therefore without a template. which is why the process is so consuming and why the answers reached then prove so durable. Developmental psychologists have described this as the central task of that period, and everything about the brain during those years is organized around it. The prefrontal cortex is still maturing and will not finish until the mid-20s. That single fact explains a great deal about the period that adults misremember as recklessness. The machinery for evaluating consequences is the last to arrive, and it arrives after the machinery for feeling everything intensely is already running at full power. A teenager is not a defective adult. A teenager is a system in which the accelerator has been installed and the brakes are still being fitted, and the reason evolution tolerates that arrangement is presumably that a creature about to leave home and construct an entire identity needs to be capable of doing things a fully calibrated risk assessor would never do. The systems governing reward and emotional intensity are running unusually hot, which is why everything at that age feels enormous, and why adults remember the feeling and find it slightly embarrassing. And the memory system appears to encode preferentially anything that bears on the question the person is trying to answer, which at that age is the question of who they are. There is a second force operating in the same window, and it compounds the first. That decade contains an extraordinary density of firsts. First love, first heartbreak, first job, first time leaving home, first funeral of someone your own age, first political conviction, first real betrayal, first time being responsible for anything. And a first is by definition unmodelled, which means it encodes at maximum resolution, while the 40th instance of the same kind of event decades later is filed as a variation on an existing pattern. So the bump is produced by two things at once: a brain in identity construction mode, encoding anything relevant to the question of who it is, and a life containing more genuinely novel experience per year than any period that will follow. Neither condition can be reinstated afterward by wanting it. You cannot have a first anything twice. And the identity question, once broadly answered, stops being urgent enough to organize a memory system around. So the music of those years is not merely music the person happened to hear. It is material they used in the construction at the time they were doing the construction. A song heard at 17 was not entertainment. It was evidence about what kind of person you might be. A proposal about how to feel. A badge you wore in front of other people whose opinion mattered more than it ever would again. It arrived during the one period of a life when a person is genuinely under construction and everything is load-bearing, which is why it cannot be replaced later. A song you encounter at 45 arrives at a completed structure and is placed somewhere in it. A song you encountered at 17 is part of the structure, and you cannot remove it without moving the walls. And music at that age is never encountered alone, which is the other half of why it binds so hard. Adolescent musical taste is social to a degree that adults forget. It is how you signalled which group you belonged to, who you were available to be friends with, and what you were refusing to be. People fought about it, sorted themselves by it, and formed their first chosen relationships around it, in a period when belonging mattered more than at any other point in a life. So a song from that window is not carrying a private memory, it is carrying a room, and the people in the room, and the particular anxiety of wanting to be accepted by them. Which is why hearing it decades later can produce a response that seems disproportionate to the music itself. A man of 65 who cannot easily discuss his feelings will be visibly altered by 3 bars of something he heard at 18 and will usually apologize for it. There is nothing to apologize for. The response is not sentimentality about a pop song. It is a whole period of a life, socially and emotionally saturated, arriving intact through the only channel that kept it. The music was never the point. It was the medium through which a person did the most important social work of their life, and it kept everything. Hold that, because it explains something people find embarrassing about themselves, and should not. Your taste at 50 is not a judgment about music. It is an archaeological record of a construction project that finished decades ago. The songs that still move you most were not selected because they are the finest things you have heard. They were present while you were being assembled, and they were built in. Which is why arguing about whether the music of someone's youth is objectively good misses the point entirely. It is like arguing about whether someone's childhood home was the best house in the country. Nobody is reporting a verdict about quality. They are reporting the location of their own foundations, which is not a matter of opinion and cannot be argued with. Now the second property, which is the one that makes music different from photographs and letters and everything else that reminds you of the past. Memory researchers have long known about context-dependent retrieval, that recall improves when the conditions of remembering match the conditions of encoding. The classic demonstration involved divers who learned word lists either on land or underwater and recalled them best in the environment where they had learnt them. Your memory is not a filing cabinet you query. It is a system that reconstructs, and the reconstruction goes better when the surrounding conditions resemble the original. Which is why walking into a building you have not entered in 20 years produces a flood of material you could not have retrieved by trying. Smell is the other famous case. And it works for a related reason. The olfactory system has unusually direct connections to the emotional and memory structures, bypassing much of the processing that other senses undergo, which is why a particular soap or kitchen or hospital corridor can produce a response before you have identified what you are smelling. But smell has a limitation that music does not. It delivers a single instantaneous cue, a switch thrown, and what follows is up to whatever it happens to connect to. Music delivers a structured sequence that unfolds over minutes, in time, with a shape you know, and it can therefore hold you in the reinstated state and develop it rather than merely triggering it. A smell opens a door. A song walks you through the building at the original pace, room by room, in the original order. And music is an unusually complete context. A photograph shows you a scene from outside. You look at it, and you are a person in the present, looking at an image of the past. A song does something different. It unfolds in time, at the same rate it did originally. Engaging your motor system and your emotional systems and your predictive machinery in the same sequence they were engaged the first time. You are not looking at the past, not observing it, not recalling it. You are rerunning a process, in your body, in the present, in the same order and at the same tempo it originally ran, which is why the experience of hearing an old song is qualitatively different from looking at an old photograph, and why people describe it with the language of transport rather than the language of recall. A photograph shows you where you were. A song puts you back in the state you were in while you were there. There is a specific quality to that, which everyone recognizes and nobody plans for, which is that it is involuntary and badly timed. You do not choose to be returned. A song comes on in a supermarket, in a taxi, in a shop you entered for something else entirely, and before you have identified it, something has already happened in your chest. The recognition is faster than the naming. People report standing still in public places, unable to explain to anyone what has occurred, sometimes in tears about a period they had not consciously thought of in years. That speed is the signature of a system running below deliberate retrieval. If it were ordinary remembering, you would have time to prepare. Instead, the state arrives first, and the explanation follows, which is exactly what you would expect from a process that engages emotional and motor circuits before the parts of the brain that handle identification have finished their work. And here is the finding that gives all of this a physical basis, and it is the reason this is not merely a video about nostalgia. In 2009, a team at the University of California, Davis, led by Peter Janata, scanned people while they listened to music from their adolescence and asked them to report when a piece triggered an autobiographical memory. The region that lit up most consistently was the medial prefrontal cortex, an area sitting behind the forehead which is heavily involved in self-referential processing, in the sense of who you are. And when Janata examined how the brain tracked the structure of the music itself, the tonal movement, he found that this same self-related region was following it, which is to say, the area of your brain most concerned with the sense of being you is also, apparently, tracking the harmonic structure of the music you loved at 19. Janata described the medial prefrontal cortex as acting like a hub in which music, memory and emotion converge, and the phrase most often quoted from that work is that this region is where the soundtrack of your life is playing. That is a journalist's phrase rather than a technical claim, and it should be treated as such. But the finding underneath it is genuine, and it is unusual, a region defined by its role in self-processing, following the tonal movement of a piece of music. Sit with the implication of that, because it changes the character of the whole subject. It suggests that music from that period is not stored beside your identity, in some adjacent file marked memories. It is entangled with the machinery of identity itself, in the same tissue, using the same circuits, which would explain a great deal. Why hearing a certain song does not feel like remembering, but like becoming, briefly, someone you used to be. Why people play the music of their youth at moments of crisis and reorganization. And why, at the very end of a life, when the self has been dismantled by disease almost to nothing, a song can still reach whatever is left. It is not reaching a memory. It appears to be reaching the same structures the person was built out of, which are, as it happens, among the last things to go. And here the honest caveat must be given plainly. This is one line of research. The imaging is correlational, and nobody has demonstrated that music reconstitutes identity in any strong sense. What has been shown is an overlap, in tissue and in tracking, between the systems that handle self and the systems that handle music of that period. That overlap is remarkable enough without inflating it, but allow the ordinary experience to sit beside the imaging for a moment, because everyone has the data. When a song from your 17th year plays, notice what actually happens. It is not that you recall an event. Frequently there is no specific event attached at all, and people report being unable to name what the song reminds them of, while being certain that it reminds them of something enormous. What arrives is more like a temperature, a way the world felt. The particular quality of anticipation you had then, or of loneliness, or of possibility. That is not the retrieval of a memory, in the ordinary sense of retrieving a fact. There is no content to it. It is the reinstatement of a condition, and the reason you cannot name what it reminds you of is that it is not reminding you of anything. It is briefly putting a version of you back online, and that version has no name because it was never a fact. It was a way of being a person. Which lets us say something precise about nostalgia, a word usually used dismissively, as though it were a failure of taste or a refusal to move on. The research suggests it is neither. What is happening when an old song moves you is not sentimentality about a period you have romanticized. It is the reactivation of a state, in tissue that overlaps with your sense of self, from the period when that self was under construction. That is a physical event, not an indulgence, and it produces measurable effects. Studies have found that nostalgic experience is associated with increased feelings of social connectedness and meaning, and that people reach for it more in conditions of loneliness or uncertainty, which suggests it functions as a regulatory mechanism rather than as a weakness. When people play the songs of their youth during a difficult period, they are not avoiding the present. They are, in effect, consulting their own foundations, and the practice appears to help. It is worth being precise about how strong that claim is, since the nostalgia literature is newer and softer than the anatomy. The research on nostalgia as a psychological resource comes largely from social psychology, a field which has had a difficult decade of replication problems, and the effects reported are modest and measured mostly through self-report. So the honest position is, there is a reasonable body of work suggesting nostalgia serves a regulatory function rather than being a symptom of maladjustment, and you should hold it more loosely than you hold the anatomy of musical memory, which rests on imaging and on tissue. What can be said without any statistical support at all is simply that human beings, everywhere, reach for the music of their youth in difficult periods without being told to, and have presumably been doing something like this for as long as there has been music. That is not evidence of efficacy, it is evidence that the impulse is deep, and impulses that deep usually have something behind them. The traditions understood the state-changing property of music with a directness the modern world has largely lost, and they were often nervous about it. Plato, in the Republic, argued that certain musical modes should be banned from the ideal state on the grounds that music does not merely please, but shapes the soul, forming character in the young before reason can evaluate it, and that a change in the styles of music is never a small matter, because it reaches the foundations. That is a strange thing for a philosopher to say, unless he had noticed something, and what he had noticed is essentially the claim of this entire night, that music enters through a channel that bypasses judgment and installs itself at the level where a person is being made. The Confucian tradition of China arrived at the same conclusion independently and organized state ritual around it, holding that correct music produces harmonious character and disordered music produces disordered people, and treating musical reform as a matter of governance rather than of art. The religious traditions went further and built the insight into their institutions rather than merely theorizing about it. Early Christian authorities argued for centuries about which music was permissible in worship, and the arguments were not about taste, they were about what the music would do to the people singing it, with some figures deeply suspicious of elaborate melody on the grounds that a congregation might end up loving the sound rather than attending to the words. The reforming movements of the 16th century fought over hymns with an intensity that looks disproportionate until you understand that both sides believe music installs belief below the level of argument, and both were correct. Some traditions restrict instrumental music in worship entirely, precisely because of its power. Others made congregational singing the center of everything. What they all agree on, across every position in the argument, is the premise that music is not decorative, that it does something to a person that speech does not, and that whatever it does happens beneath deliberation and is therefore worth being careful about. And the religious traditions built their most important moments on it. Weddings have music, funerals have music, initiation, ordination, coronation, the marking of every threshold a human being crosses, is accompanied by sound organized in time, and the choice of that music is never casual and is often fought over. The break goes on here. As always, none of these traditions knew about the medial prefrontal cortex, and Plato's musical theory contains a great deal that is simply wrong. A structural parallel is not a proof, but notice what they had observed, empirically, over centuries. That music at a threshold does something that words at a threshold do not. That the music of a formative period marks a person permanently, and that if you want to install something in a human being at the level where it cannot be argued away, you set it to a tune. They had no mechanism, and they were right about the effect, which is the same pattern we have found in every one of these investigations. So the picture is nearly assembled, and it is worth holding all of it at once before the practical turn. A memory system that writes music across half a dozen structures at once, and can therefore lose most of them and still retrieve. A window in adolescence when a person is under construction, during which whatever is playing becomes part of the structure rather than a decoration on it. A region concerned with the sense of self that appears to track the music of that window, and an illness that dismantles a person in a sequence which leaves those systems intact until very late. 4 separate facts from 4 separate literatures, none of which was gathered with the others in mind. Put those 4 things together, and you have an explanation for the woman singing in 1962. And you also have a practical question that a great many people watching tonight need answered. If the channel is still open, what can actually be done with it? Can this be used? There is a real answer, and there is also an industry of overstatement around it that I am going to have to take apart before the answer is worth anything. Because here is the difficulty with a finding like this one. It is genuinely hopeful. It involves the most vulnerable people in any society, and it is therefore surrounded by claims that outrun the evidence by a very long way. You will find material asserting that music reverses dementia, that it restores lost memories permanently, that it can substitute for medication. None of that is supported. What is supported is narrower, and it is still worth having, and separating the two is the most useful thing this video can do for anyone currently sitting beside a person who no longer recognizes them. There is also one specific practice, requiring no equipment beyond a list of songs and someone willing to compile it, which has changed how a number of care institutions operate, and which turns entirely on a detail we have already established tonight, that the songs must come from a particular decade of that person's life, and that a generic playlist of pleasant old music does almost nothing. That is where we go next. You can reach someone nobody else can reach, not by trying harder, not by visiting more often, not by any of the things you have already exhausted yourself attempting. You find out what was playing when that person was 19, and you play it to them, in headphones, and you wait. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a cure. Nothing about the disease changes. And I will be precise tonight about how much and how little this does for you. But the practice exists. It is used in care institutions in several countries. It costs you almost nothing, and its effectiveness turns entirely on a detail most people get wrong. The music must be theirs. not old music, not calming music, not the music of their era in general, not what you happen to like or what you assume someone of that generation enjoyed. The specific songs from the specific window of that specific life. The reasoning follows directly from the anatomy. A generic playlist of period music engages the auditory system and produces, at best, mild pleasantness. A song from a person's own bump engages the distributed network we have been describing, motor, emotional, autobiographical, predictive, and the self-referential regions that appear to track music from that period specifically. One is sound. The other is a key cut for one particular lock, in one particular door, in one particular house. And the difference in response, as anyone who has done this properly will tell you, is not subtle. It is the difference between a person tolerating background noise and a person turning their head. The observable signs are consistent enough that care staff learn to watch for them in a specific order. The eyes change first, usually within seconds, before any other movement, a shift from the unfocused middle distance that characterizes advanced dementia to actual fixation on something. Then the face, which in a person far into the illness is often flat and difficult to read, begins to carry expression again. Then movement, which is nearly always rhythmic, a foot, a hand on the arm of a chair, a head, and in a significant minority of cases, the words, which arrive intact and in order from a person who has not produced a complete sentence in months. Not every time, and not for everyone, but when it happens the sequence is recognizable, and the people who work with this describe the first time they saw it in the way people describe seeing something they had been told about and had privately not believed. So here is what this stretch does. First, the practice itself, where it came from, what it involves, and the specific errors that make it fail. Second, the honest state of the evidence, which is genuinely mixed and which has been badly misrepresented in both directions, by advocates who claim far too much and by critics who dismiss effects that patients and families can plainly see. And third, what the practice is actually for, which turns out not to be memory at all, and which is the part that matters most to anyone sitting beside a person who no longer knows their name. The practice is usually called personalized music, and its rise owes a great deal to a social worker named Dan Cohen, who in the mid-2000s noticed something absurd, that if he were ever in a nursing home, none of his own music would be available to him, and that nobody had thought to ask any of the residents what theirs was. He began putting music players together with individually compiled playlists, working with families to identify what each person had actually listened to. The initial resistance he met is instructive. The difficulty was not scientific, but administrative. Since a personalized playlist requires someone to spend an hour finding out about a resident, and institutional time is allocated in 15-minute units against tasks that can be documented. Nobody was against the idea. There was simply no box on any form for finding out who a person had been. The organization that grew from this, and the documentary that followed it, brought the approach to public attention, and the footage of a previously unresponsive man becoming animated when his own music began is among the most widely seen material of its kind. In it, a man who has barely spoken for years answers questions in complete sentences after listening, and describes what music does for him with a fluency that startles everyone present, and then, over the following minutes, recedes again. It is also, as we discussed, selected footage, and the impression it created has done both good and harm. The method is simple enough to describe in a sentence and difficult to do properly. You interview the family at length about what the person listened to between roughly their mid-teens and mid-20s, and you look for specifics, not a genre, not an era, but the actual recordings. Then you use headphones. Because the isolation matters, ambient music in a day room is competing with everything else in the room and produces nothing. Then you observe, and you adjust, because the first list is usually wrong, and the response to particular tracks tells you more than any interview did. Care staff who do this well describe it as detective work, and the detection is necessary because the person who could have answered the questions is precisely the person who can no longer answer them. That difficulty has a practical implication that almost nobody acts on, and I want to state it plainly because it is the only piece of advice in this entire video that you can act on tonight, regardless of your circumstances. Ask people while they can still answer. Ask your parents what they listened to at 18 and where they heard it and what it meant, and write it down. Not for a project, not for a scrapbook, as a piece of practical preparation for a situation nobody wants to think about, and roughly one family in 3 eventually faces. It takes an evening. It requires no equipment. And the people who have had to reconstruct this information afterward, from siblings and cousins and guesswork, describe the reconstruction as one of the more painful things they did. Because every question is a reminder of what has already gone. Ask now, while the answer is easy to obtain and costs nothing but a conversation which, incidentally, both of you will probably enjoy. Which brings us to why it so often fails, and the failures are instructive. The commonest error is generic period music, chosen by a well-meaning relative or activities coordinator on the basis of decade rather than biography, which misses because a person born in 1940 did not listen to everything from 1958. They listened to a specific and often narrow set of things, and the rest of that decade is as foreign to them as it is to you. The second error is the wrong window, usually childhood music selected on the assumption that earlier means deeper, when the anatomy says the crucial material is adolescent and early adult. The third is treating it as ambient, playing music in a shared space and expecting an individual response. And the fourth, which is subtler and more common than any of them, is treating the music as a treatment rather than as a doorway, putting the headphones on, walking away, and returning later to find nothing has changed. The music opens something. Whether anything comes through it depends on whether a person is there. There is also a caution that the enthusiastic accounts leave out, and it should be said. Music can distress. A song bound to a period of grief, a piece associated with a person who died, a hymn from a funeral, can produce agitation rather than pleasure, and in someone who cannot explain what is wrong, that agitation is difficult to interpret and slow to settle. Care staff who use this well watch for it and remove the headphones without waiting to be asked. Volume is a second issue, since older people frequently have hearing loss, and the temptation is to compensate by turning it up beyond what is comfortable. And headphones themselves can be alarming to a person who does not understand what is being placed on their head, which means the introduction has to be gentle and abandoned if it is not welcome. None of this makes the practice risky in any serious sense. It makes it something requiring attention rather than a device that can be applied and left, which is exactly what it is most often turned into in a busy institution. So hold the practice as it stands, because the specifications are the whole thing, individually compiled, not generic. From adolescence and early adulthood, not childhood and not the general period. Delivered through headphones, not into a room, and used as an opening rather than as a dose, with someone present to meet whatever appears. Every one of those specifications follows directly from what we know about how musical memory is stored, and each of them is routinely ignored, which is a significant part of why the results in the literature are so uneven. A trial in which half the participants received generic period music through a day room speaker is not testing the same intervention as one in which each person received their own songs on headphones with a carer present, and yet both will appear in a review as music therapy for dementia. Now the evidence, honestly, because this is where I have to disappoint a certain kind of expectation. The research on music-based interventions in dementia is a genuinely mixed literature. There are systematic reviews, including work by the Cochrane Collaboration, which is about as skeptical and methodologically severe an organization as exists in medicine. Their assessments of music-based therapeutic interventions in dementia have generally concluded that these approaches probably reduce depressive symptoms and may improve overall behavioral problems, with the evidence on agitation, cognition, and quality of life being weaker and less certain. That is a real finding, and it is not nothing. It is also considerably more modest than the impression created by a viral video, and anyone who tells you that music has been shown to restore memory or slow the disease is misrepresenting the state of the field. The reasons the evidence is difficult are worth understanding rather than glossing, because they explain the gap between what carers see and what trials measure. Blinding is nearly impossible. You cannot conceal from a participant or a nurse whether music is playing. Effects are often short-lived, appearing during and shortly after listening and fading within hours, which means a trial measuring outcomes weekly may find nothing while a person sitting in the room sees something obvious. The interventions themselves vary enormously between studies, from a therapist leading a group to a personalized playlist on headphones, and pooling them is like pooling different drugs, because they are all tablets. And the outcomes that are easiest to measure, cognitive test scores, are precisely the outcomes least likely to change, while the outcomes families care about most. Whether their mother seemed present for 20 minutes are the hardest to quantify. So the honest summary is this: modest, real, mostly short-term effects on mood and behavior, with the strongest and most consistent signal being the one that is hardest to put in a table. That gap between what trials capture and what rooms contain is worth taking seriously rather than resolving too quickly in either direction. The skeptical reading is that carers are seeing what they hope to see, and that hope is a powerful generator of observation in exactly this situation. Families desperate for contact will interpret an ambiguous movement generously, and there is nothing shameful or unusual about that. The other reading is that the instruments are pointed at the wrong things. A trial that measures cognitive score at 6 weeks will detect nothing correctly, because nothing has happened to cognition. It will also entirely miss the fact that during 11 of those weeks, a man sang with his wife. Both readings are defensible, and the truth is probably some of each. What can be said with confidence is that the intervention is cheap, non-pharmacological, has minimal side effects, and produces at least modest improvements in mood, which by the standards of dementia care, where the available drugs are of limited benefit and considerable cost, is not a small offer. Which brings us to the thing that reframes the whole practice, and it took the field a long time to say it out loud. This is not a memory intervention. Nobody is retrieving lost autobiographical material or reversing anything. What the music appears to do is temporarily restore access to mood, to attention, to responsiveness, and above all, to the possibility of interaction. And that matters because of what the disease actually takes from families. Ask a carer what is hardest, and almost none of them will say the forgetting. They will say the loss of contact. The person is present, physically, in front of you, and there is no route in, conversation fails, questions distress, and every visit becomes an accumulation of failed attempts to reach someone who is right there. That is the specific suffering of this illness, and it belongs to both people in the room. There is a phrase used in this field, ambiguous loss, and it names something that people going through it often cannot articulate and feel guilty for feeling. The person is alive and present, and also, in the sense that matters most, gone, and there is no ritual for that, no funeral, no point at which anyone acknowledges a death and brings food. Grief requires an object that has departed, and here the object is sitting in a chair in front of you, needing lunch. So the mourning has nowhere to go, and it runs alongside the caring for years, and the carer frequently cannot distinguish their own exhaustion from their own guilt. This is the context in which any claim about music has to be evaluated, and it is why overstatement in this area is not a harmless enthusiasm. A family told that music restores memory will try it, and it will not restore memory, and they will conclude that they did it wrong, or that their person is further gone than others. And a small measure of additional pain will have been added to a situation that did not need any. What personalized music offers is a channel, not the person returned, not memory restored, but a period, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes an hour, in which interaction is possible again. Eye contact, singing together, a hand held in rhythm, a shared activity that requires nothing the person can no longer do. It requires no orientation to time, no recall of names, no ability to follow a conversation. It asks only for the capacity to be in a piece of music with someone, which is, of everything a person has, among the last to go. Care staff report that the most valuable effects are often not during the music, but in the half hour afterward, when a person who has been unreachable all day is suddenly available for a conversation of sorts, or for being washed without distress, or for eating. The music does not repair anything. It opens a window, and things can be done through a window. That afterward effect deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it is the part with practical consequences for anyone doing daily care. Many of the hardest moments in dementia care are not conversations, they are tasks. Washing, dressing, eating, medication, moving from one room to another, all of which can produce distress and resistance in a person who does not understand what is being done to them or why a stranger is touching them. Staff who use personalized music report that these tasks become substantially easier during and shortly after listening. And there is some published work supporting reductions in agitation around care activities, which reframes the whole thing away from the emotional footage and towards something more mundane and arguably more valuable, not a moving reunion, but a man who can be helped to wash without becoming frightened. That is not the kind of outcome that makes a documentary. It is the kind of outcome that makes a life bearable for two people, several times a day, for years. Let me put one scene in front of you, because it is late and a single moment does more than another study. A woman visits her father twice a week. He has not known who she is for 2 years. She has tried photographs which distress him and questions which distress him more, and eventually she stopped talking about the past at all, and the visits became an hour of sitting beside a stranger who occasionally looks at her with polite incomprehension. Then someone suggests the music, and she spends an evening on the phone to an aunt, establishing what he listened to in 1961, and the next week she brings it. And what happens is not that he recognizes her. He does not. What happens is that he sings, and she sings, and for a while they are two people doing something together, which is the thing she had assumed was finished forever. She still visits a man who does not know her name, but she is no longer visiting alone, and there is a detail in accounts like hers that recurs so often it is worth naming. The person doing the singing is frequently astonished to discover that they know the words too. A daughter who would have said she had no idea what her father listened to in 1961 finds, 3 lines in, that the song is entirely available to her, because it was playing in the house of her own childhood, in the background, while she was doing something else. So the music turns out to be shared property, laid down in 2 different windows for 2 different reasons, and the singing that follows is not one person performing for another. It is 2 people who have both had that song in them for decades, arriving at it from opposite directions. Families describe that as the moment something changes, and it is not hard to see why. For the first time in years, they are not managing a patient. They are doing something with a relative, both of them competent at it, both of them contributing. That is what this is, and it is worth being precise about how much it is and how much it is not. Because families need accuracy more than they need encouragement. It is not recognition. It is not the person coming back. It is not a treatment. It will not extend anyone's life by a single day. What it is company, a way of being with someone in the present tense that does not depend on the faculties the disease has taken. And it turns out that a very great deal of what people want from each other never depended on those faculties in the first place. Sitting with someone, making a sound together, being in the same rhythm for 4 minutes. Almost everything we call closeness can be done without a single fact being exchanged, which is a discovery families make in this situation, and which almost nobody makes any earlier. It is worth wondering, before you are forced into that discovery, how much of your own contact with the people you love is currently conducted entirely through information, arrangements, updates, opinions, the exchange of facts about the week. Because if the facts are the part that can be lost, and the sitting and the sound and the rhythm are the part that survives, then a relationship built mostly on information is built mostly on the fragile layer. Families who go through this often say afterward that they wish they had known which parts were which, and here the traditions were, once again, ahead of us, though they arrived from a different direction. Every tradition that has thought carefully about the dying has arrived at the same practical instruction: sing to them. Jewish tradition includes prayers and psalms recited at the bedside of the dying, and the psalms are chanted rather than read. Christian practice surrounds a deathbed with familiar material learned in childhood, and hospital chaplains report consistently that a person far past speech will move their lips to the words of a prayer or hymn they learned 60 years earlier. Chaplains describe this as one of the most reliable phenomena in their work, and many of them learn early to lead with the oldest material rather than the most theologically apt, because the oldest material is the material that arrives. Islamic practice involves recitation at the bedside, in a form the dying person has heard in the same cadence their whole life. Buddhist practice includes chanting at the moment of death and afterward. In none of these traditions was anyone reasoning about the relative sparing of the anterior cingulate. They had simply observed, over a very large number of deathbeds, that when everything else fails, sound organized in time still arrives. The break, firmly, as always. Those practices were performed for theological reasons, to accompany a soul, to secure a passage, to fulfill an obligation, and their practitioners would not recognize the framing I am giving them. A structural parallel is not a proof, and the fact that a chant reaches a dying person tells you nothing whatever about what the chant claims. But there is something legitimately here, and it is the same thing we found in the archives of memory, that human beings discovered, empirically, without any mechanism, that music is the last channel to close, and they built their most important moments around that discovery. The maternity ward and the deathbed are the two ends of a human life, and in almost every culture on earth both of them have singing in them. That is not sentiment. It is a very old piece of applied neurology, arrived at by people who had no idea that was what they were doing. And the bookend is worth following, because it is not a coincidence. The music at the beginning of a life and the music at the end are doing structurally similar work. A lullaby is not information, an infant does not understand a word of it, and the words are frequently disturbing when examined, which nobody minds, because the content is not the point. What a lullaby delivers is a human voice, in rhythm, at close range, from someone whose presence signals safety, to a nervous system too immature to process anything more complicated. And a hymn sung at a deathbed is delivering the same package to a nervous system that has lost the ability to process anything more complicated. At both ends of a human life, when language fails, the same solution appears, and it appears independently in cultures that share nothing else. Sound, organized in time, delivered by a person who is present. It is the first thing we can receive, and the last thing we can receive, and everything in between, all the talking and explaining and arguing, sits in the middle of a life that is bracketed at both ends by singing. So the account is nearly complete. A memory written across so many systems that a disease has to demolish several to erase it. A window in adolescence that fixes a particular decade of music into the structure of a self. A region concerned with identity that appears to track that music specifically. A practice built on all of it, modest in its measured effects and considerable in what it makes possible. And a set of traditions that arrived at the same place with no instruments and a great deal of attention. But I promised you an accounting, and the objections to all of this are serious. There is a case to be made that this entire framework romanticizes a devastating illness, that the emphasis on preserved musical memory offers a consoling story to families at the cost of accuracy about what is actually left of a person. And there is the last question, the one underneath everything tonight, which no scan will answer. If a person cannot remember their own life, cannot name their own children, and yet can still sing every word of a song from 1962, then what exactly is it that is still in there? What is a person when the facts are gone and the music remains? That reckoning is where we go now. You are not what you remember. That sounds to you like consolation, and it is not. It is where your whole night has been heading, and it has an evidential basis. This is not a metaphor. There are people alive tonight who cannot name their own children, cannot tell you the year, cannot retrieve one fact about their own lives, and who will sing you 4 verses of a song from 1962 with the phrasing intact and their face changed while they do it. Something is in there. It is not made of facts, not of names, not of dates, not of anything anyone could have written down, because those are precisely what the illness takes first. What it is made of instead is the last thing your night has to offer. And before you take it, you should watch it survive the strongest arguments against it. The first objection is the heaviest, and it is aimed directly at videos like this one. It says, "This romanticizes a devastating illness." Dementia is not a poetic dismantling that leaves a musical essence behind. It is incontinence, terror, aggression, the loss of speech and swallowing, the destruction of a personality, and finally death, usually after years in which the person suffers and the family is ground down. To tell that story as a house whose last room contains music is to aestheticize something that families experience as unrelieved horror, and the aestheticizing serves the listener's comfort rather than the patient's condition. Worse, it may leave people who see no musical response feeling that their person is somehow further gone, more thoroughly erased than the ones in the videos. That objection is correct in every particular, and I accept it without qualification. Nothing tonight should be heard as a redemptive account of this disease. There is nothing redemptive about it. What I have described is a narrow anatomical fact with a narrow practical use, and if the framing has made it sound like a consolation prize for a catastrophe, the framing is at fault. And it is worth being specific about what is actually being minimized when this subject is handled prettily, because vagueness protects the speaker rather than the listener. The illness typically runs for years. In the middle stages, a person may be frightened much of the time, in a world that no longer makes sense, with strangers doing intimate things to their body for reasons they cannot follow. Aggression is common and is nearly always fear. Personality changes can be complete, so that a gentle person becomes cruel, and a family loses not only their mother's memory, but her character. Carers develop clinical rates of depression and anxiety, frequently give up work, and often say afterward that the years of caring took more from them than the death did. That is the situation into which any claim about music enters, and if it enters as an uplifting story, it will land as an insult. It should enter as what it is, one small thing that sometimes works, offered by someone who is not going to pretend the rest is bearable. The second objection concerns the evidence, and we have already conceded most of it. The imaging work on musical memory is a small literature. The Cochrane assessments find modest, uncertain effects. The viral footage is selected, the mechanism studies are correlational, and the connecting narrative I have offered. From anatomy through the reminiscence bump to the practice is a synthesis nobody has tested as a whole. Someone who knows this field well could reasonably say that I have taken a handful of real findings and assembled them into something considerably more confident than any of them supports. That is a fair charge, and I have flagged the joins as I went. What I will say in reply is only this: the load-bearing claim tonight is not about efficacy. It is that musical memory is stored differently and survives longer, and that claim rests on imaging, on pathology maps, and on the fact that every long-term care institution on Earth can produce examples. The practice built on top of it may or may not have the effects its advocates claim. The anatomy underneath it is not in dispute. The third objection is aimed at the sentence I have been building toward all night, and it is the sharpest. It says, "You are about to claim that music reaches something essential about a person, some self that survives the loss of memory, and that is a metaphysical claim dressed in neuroscience. A preserved procedural capacity is not a soul. A woman singing a song she performed 10,000 times is demonstrating that motor sequences are durable, which is interesting, and is not evidence that anyone is still in there. To move from spared tissue to preserved personhood is to smuggle in exactly the comforting conclusion that families want and that the data cannot deliver. That is the objection I take most seriously, because it is the one I am most tempted to violate. So let me be careful. I am not claiming that music proves a self persists. I do not know what is present in a person at that stage, and neither does anyone else, and anyone who tells you confidently either way is exceeding the evidence in one direction or the other. What can be said is narrower, and I think still substantial. Something responds. It responds selectively to specific material from a specific period of a specific life, in a way that generic material does not produce. Whatever is doing the responding has preferences, and preferences are not nothing. A tape recorder plays back whatever is put into it. This does not. It discriminates. It is moved by one thing and indifferent to another, and the discrimination follows the shape of a life that the person can no longer recount. Whether that constitutes a self in any philosophically robust sense is not something I can settle, and the fact that I cannot settle it is exactly why the honest thing is to keep treating them as though someone is there. The cost of being wrong in that direction is nothing. The cost of being wrong in the other direction is that you spent the last 2 years of somebody's life talking over their head. There is a fourth objection, and it belongs to a specific group of people who deserve to be addressed directly rather than left out of the account. It comes from those who tried this and nothing happened, who compiled the playlist, got the decade right, used headphones, sat with their person, and watched no change at all, no eyes, no face, no movement, nothing. Everything in this video, to them, is a description of an experience other families had, and they did not. And there is a particular loneliness in that which the enthusiastic literature never addresses. So let me address it. The effect is not universal, and nobody claims it is. Musical response depends on the stage of the illness, on which pathology is present, since not all dementias follow the Alzheimer's pattern, on hearing, on medication, on whether the person was musical in the first place, and on a good deal that is simply not understood. A person who does not respond has not failed, and neither have you, and it does not mean they are further gone, or less present, or less worth visiting. It means one particular door, among the doors that were tried, was not open in this case. Other things reach people: touch, smell, familiar objects, the voice of a specific person, being outside, animals. The music is one route that happens to have been studied. It was never the only one, and its failure in your case is data about a door, not a verdict on anybody. So what survives all four? Take it in order, because this is the version to keep. Musical memory is not stored in one place. It is written across motor, emotional, autobiographical, auditory and predictive systems simultaneously, which is why partial destruction of the network still permits retrieval. The regions most involved in long-term musical memory sit in territory that Alzheimer's disease damages comparatively late, which was established by mapping the memory regions in healthy brains first, and then overlaying the known pathology. A window in adolescence and early adulthood encodes preferentially, which is why the songs that survive are from a specific decade and why generic period music does almost nothing. Not a genre, not an era. Theirs, a region concerned with the sense of self, appears to track music from that window in particular, and a practice built on all of it produces modest, real, mostly short-term improvements in mood and behavior, and, more importantly, opens a channel of interaction when every other channel has closed. Every one of those is documented. The synthesis is mine. The pieces are not. Take it once more slowly, the way you would take something you intend to keep. A song is not a file, but a chord struck across half a dozen systems at once, which is why 3 notes can retrieve 40 years. A woman who cannot name her son, singing 4 verses she learned before he was born, because the room those verses are kept in is the last one the fire reaches. A window between 15 and 25, when a person is under construction and everything that passes through becomes structural rather than decorative. A region concerned with the sense of self, tracking the harmony of music from precisely that window. A generic playlist producing nothing, and a personal one producing a turned head. Cochrane finding modest, real, mostly short-term effects on mood. Care staff finding that the 20 minutes afterward are when a person can be washed without fear. And a daughter, in a chair, singing with a man who does not know her name. No longer visiting alone. And now, the traditions, because they have been standing behind this entire subject, and they have more to say about it than the science does. Not because they knew more, but because they were asking a different question. The neuroscience asks what survives. The traditions asked what a person is, which is the question you actually need answered when you are sitting beside someone who does not know your name. No scan will answer it, and the fact that it cannot be answered by measurement does not make it a soft question or an optional one. It is the most consequential question in the room, because everything anyone does at that bedside follows from the answer they are carrying. And almost nobody has examined the answer they are carrying. Start with the assumption our own culture makes, since it is invisible until you look at it. We identify a person with their mind, and their mind with their memories and their reasoning, and this is so deeply built into how we think that the loss of memory feels like the loss of the person. That identification is not universal, and it is not old. It has a traceable history in Western philosophy, and its most influential statement comes from John Locke, who argued in the 17th century that personal identity consists in continuity of consciousness, that you are the same person as the boy in that photograph, if and only if you can remember being him. It is an elegant theory, and it has a consequence that Locke did not emphasize, and that families discover in hospital corridors. On that account, a person who cannot remember anything is, strictly, no longer the same person, and eventually not a person in the relevant sense at all. Almost everyone in a modern hospital operates on some version of that assumption, and it is the source of a particular kind of despair. You can hear the assumption operating in the language people use without noticing. She's not really there anymore. He's gone. The body's just still here. There's nothing left of the person I knew. Those sentences are not descriptions. They are conclusions drawn from a philosophical premise. And the premise is that a person is constituted by their retrievable mental contents. Nobody who says them has consciously adopted Locke's theory of personal identity. They have inherited it, the way one inherits a language, and it does its work in them invisibly, and it determines how they behave in the room, whether they speak to the person or about them, whether they explain what they are about to do before touching them, whether they say goodbye. And here is the thing worth noticing. Even people who firmly hold that view rarely act on it consistently. They keep visiting. They keep talking to someone they have just described as absent. Something in them refuses the conclusion their own theory delivers, which is usually a sign that the theory is missing something. The religious traditions do not make that identification, and their alternative is worth stating carefully. In the Christian account, a person's worth is not a function of their capacities. It is conferred rather than earned, held by God rather than generated by the individual, and it therefore does not diminish when the capacities do. That is why the tradition's hospitals took in the incurable, why its most emphasized parable concerns a man who stops for someone he has no reason to help, and why its practices of care are organized around presence rather than around outcome. Whether or not one accepts the theology, notice what it does to the situation in the room. If a person is a bundle of memories, then dementia is subtraction, and there is progressively less there to visit. If a person is held in being by something other than their own faculties, then the person in the chair is entirely present, and it is only the access that has been damaged. Those two beliefs produce visibly different behavior at a bedside, and anyone who has spent time in these institutions can tell you which staff hold which. The difference shows in small things, and the small things are the whole of the job. Whether someone announces themselves on entering the room, whether they explain what they are about to do before doing it to a person who will not remember the explanation, whether they say the person's name or address them at all, rather than conducting the entire interaction over their head with a colleague, whether they knock. None of that changes any outcome that a trial could measure, and all of it changes what it is like to be in that bed, if there is anyone in it, which is precisely the question at issue. Institutions that get this right tend to have someone in their history who insisted on it for reasons that were originally religious, and this is one of the places where a theological premise about the unconditional worth of persons has produced a concrete and defensible practice, whatever one thinks of the premise. It is also, incidentally, why the hospice movement began where it began, and why its founder was a woman with a specific set of convictions about what is owed to the dying. The Jewish tradition supplies a related emphasis through its treatment of the elderly, with a commandment to rise before the aged, and an interpretive tradition insisting that this respect is owed regardless of the person's condition or capacity. The commandment does not contain a clause about lucidity. It applies to the person who can still teach you something, and to the person who can no longer complete a sentence on the same terms, which is a legal way of making a claim about worth. There is a famous rabbinic reading concerning the broken tablets of the law, that when Moses shattered the first set, the fragments were not discarded, but carried in the ark alongside the whole ones for the entire journey. The tradition does not read that as an incidental detail of transport logistics. It reads it as a statement about what is owed to what has been broken. The broken tablets are not less holy for being broken. They are carried in the same ark, on the same journey, with the same care. And no one proposes leaving them behind, because they can no longer be read. Whatever one makes of the theology, it is a striking image to hold beside a person whose memory has fractured. The broken tablets travel in the ark, and they travel there because they are still the tablets. The Buddhist traditions come at it from an angle so different that it takes a moment to see the relevance. and then it is difficult to unsee. They deny that there is a fixed, persisting self at all, and hold that the sense of a continuous person is a construction assembled moment to moment from changing processes. Read carelessly. That sounds like the bleakest possible thing to say about dementia. Read carefully. It is nearly the opposite. If nobody has a permanent self, and if what we call a person is a process rather than a possession, then a person with dementia is not failing to be what everyone else is. They are exhibiting, more visibly than the rest of us, the condition everyone is in. The tradition's practical response follows. Compassion is owed to a being who suffers, and the entitlement to that compassion does not depend on the being having an intact autobiography. It is not that the person has lost their self. It is that nobody had one in the way we imagined, and the illness has simply made that undeniable in one case. There is a practical corollary in that tradition which lands squarely on this situation, and it concerns where compassion is directed. If the entitlement to care depended on the recipient being a coherent, continuous, appreciative person, then a great deal of care would be conditional, and the tradition is emphatic that it is not. The being in front of you suffers. That is sufficient, and nothing further needs to be established, which quietly dissolves a question that torments a great many carers in the small hours, whether it is still worth going, whether their mother is still in there to receive it, whether the visits mean anything if they are not remembered 10 minutes later. On this account, the question is malformed. The visit is not a deposit into a memory account. It is an act toward a being who is present now, and its value does not depend on being recalled, any more than the value of a meal depends on the eater remembering it a week later. That is a genuinely useful reframing whatever one believes about anatta and rebirth, and it is one of the few things that reliably helps people who are exhausting themselves visiting someone who cannot thank them. And the Hindu traditions supply the sharpest formulation of the alternative to Locke in their distinction between the changing contents of a mind and the awareness in which those contents appear. On that account, memories, thoughts, and personality are things a person has rather than things a person is. They arise and pass, and what remains is the witnessing itself, which is not composed of any of them. It is a metaphysical claim. It cannot be tested, and I am not asserting it, but I would point out what it predicts, which is that even in the most advanced dismantling of the contents, something would still be present, and would still respond to what it valued, and would still be worth addressing directly, rather than talked about in the third person, while it sits in the room. That prediction happens to be what carers who spend years at this end up believing, almost regardless of what they believed when they started. That is not evidence for the metaphysics. People who spend years in emotionally overwhelming situations tend to arrive at beliefs that make those situations bearable, and that is a well-known bias rather than a discovery. But it is worth noting that the drift runs in one direction. People rarely start out convinced that someone is present and conclude, after 5 years of daily contact, that nobody is. It usually goes the other way. Now the brake, held down hard, because this is the most seductive section of the night, and I have been circling something I cannot prove. None of those traditions was making a neurological claim, and none of their accounts of personhood is confirmed by anything in this video. Spared tissue is not a soul. A preserved motor sequence is not evidence of a witness. The overlap between a self-referential brain region and musical tracking is a correlation in a small literature, and it does not establish that anyone is home in the sense that word usually carries. A structural parallel is not a proof. What I am claiming is only that our culture's default account of personhood, in which a person is essentially their memories, is a philosophical position rather than an obvious fact, that it is not shared by most of the human race across most of history, and that it has consequences at bedsides. You are free to hold it. You should know that you are holding it, and that there are alternatives, and that the alternatives are not obviously worse. Which brings me to the thing I have been trying to earn the right to say for 3 hours. When a woman who cannot name her daughter sings every word of a song from 1962, the fact that startles everyone is the singing. It is the wrong fact. The remarkable thing is not that a motor sequence survived. Motor sequences are known to be durable, and a neurologist would not be surprised. The remarkable thing is the face. Because the response is not mechanical, it is selective, it is emotional, it discriminates between her songs and other songs, and it produces an expression that everyone in the room recognizes immediately, and nobody can quite name. Something in there prefers something, not responds to sound, not reacts to stimulation, prefers. Something in there is moved by one thing and not another, in a person from whom every fact has been removed. And whatever that is, it is not memory, because the memory is gone. It is whatever was underneath the memory the whole time. And there is a second observation that carers make constantly, and that nobody has adequately explained, which points in the same direction. Long after names and faces have gone, people frequently retain something that can only be described as a disposition towards specific individuals. They do not know who you are. They cannot tell you your name or your relationship to them, or produce a single fact about your shared history. And they are visibly calmer when you are in the room, and agitated when you leave. And different with you than with the staff. There is no memory doing that work. The memory has been tested, and it is not there. Something else is tracking who is present. It is possible that this is simply familiarity at a level below recognition, a kind of procedural knowledge of a person in the way one has procedural knowledge of a piano. That is probably the correct explanation, and it is not deflationary in the least, because it means the relationship was stored in the durable layer along with the music, rather than in the layer made of facts. You knew them. They may still know you, in whatever way a body knows a song, and this is the finding that reaches past the illness and into your own life tonight, which is the reason this was worth 2.5 hours. You have spent your whole life assuming you are your memories, your history, your accumulated facts, the story you can tell about yourself. That assumption is not obviously true, and the evidence tonight cuts against it. The layer that goes first, in the most common dismantling a human being undergoes, is the layer of facts. What remains longest is rhythm and preference and emotional response, and the capacity to be moved by particular sounds encountered in a particular decade, which suggests, if it suggests anything, that what a person most fundamentally is sits closer to what they love than to what they know. That is not a spiritual claim, it is an inference from the order in which the lights go out. Follow that inference into an ordinary evening, and it changes what you are looking at. You have spent a great deal of your life accumulating qualifications, information, competence, the ability to give an account of yourself. All of it real, all of it useful, and all of it in the layer that goes first. Meanwhile, there is another set of things you have never thought of as achievements at all, because they do not look like achievements. The songs you love, the way you move when nobody is watching, your responses to particular voices, the physical habits of affection you learnt so early you cannot remember learning them. Nobody puts those on a curriculum vitae. They turn out to be the durable substrate, which does not mean the accumulating was wasted. You have to be a functioning person, and functioning requires facts. It means only that the hierarchy most people carry, in which the mind is the essential part and the rest is support, has the order backwards relative to what the illness reveals. And there is a mild but real consolation in that for anyone who has ever felt that they were not accomplishing enough. The part of you that will last longest was never accomplished. It was absorbed, mostly before you were 25, mostly without your noticing. This is the same threshold every one of these investigations reaches. When we followed the body's response to events that had not yet happened, the instruments were exact and the meaning was left entirely open. When we asked why you wake at 3, the biology was precise and silent about what to do with the hour. When we found that nothing has ever touched anything, the physics was complete and explained nothing about a hand held in a hospital room. Tonight the anatomy is clear, and it cannot tell you what a person is. The universe is generous with facts and silent about their significance. That silence is not emptiness. It is the space where a person becomes responsible for their own understanding, which is the only place understanding has ever come from. And notice the pattern once more. The closer we look at something entirely ordinary, in this case, a song stuck in someone's head, the stranger and larger it becomes. So what do you do with this? 3 things, and they cost almost nothing. First, and this is the one to do this week regardless of anyone's health, and the only instruction in this entire video that everyone listening can act on, ask the people you love what they listened to when they were young. Not as a project, as a conversation you will enjoy, which happens to leave you holding something that becomes irreplaceable if the situation ever arises. Write down the actual songs, the specific recordings, and ask where they heard them and who they were with. It will take one evening. It may turn out to be one of the more interesting evenings you have had with that person, because almost nobody has ever asked them, and the material is right at the top of their memory, waiting for someone to. Second, if you are already in this situation, use what tonight described properly, their music, from their late teens and early 20s, on headphones, with you present and prepared to sing along badly. Expect the first list to be wrong, and expect to revise it. Watch the eyes, rather than waiting for words, and stay in the room, because the music is the door, and you are the reason to come through it, not as a treatment, as a way of being together that does not require them to do anything they can no longer do. And third, the largest one, which applies whether or not anyone in your life is ill. Notice which parts of your relationships are made of information and which are made of everything else, because the information is the fragile layer in all of us, and the other parts are the ones that hold. That third one is worth a moment, because it is the only part of tonight that might change something before anyone is ill. Consider how a typical adult relationship with a parent is actually conducted. Phone calls consisting of updates, logistics, health reports, news about other relatives, and opinions about events. Information, almost entirely. Now consider what would be left if the information were removed, which is exactly the experiment the illness performs. For a good many families the answer is very little, because nothing else was ever built. And for others there is a great deal, because somewhere along the way they also did things together, sang, cooked, walked the same route, held each other, sat in silence in a car. Those are the deposits in the durable layer, and they are made by doing rather than by talking. This is not an argument for talking less to the people you love. It is an observation that a relationship consisting only of exchanged information is a relationship stored entirely in the part that can be lost, and that the remedy is not a technique, but the ordinary business of doing something together, which most people stop doing with their parents around the age of 20 and never resume. Tonight, somewhere, a person who does not know what year it is, or where they are, or who is sitting beside them, is going to hear the opening bars of something they first heard at 19. And they will not remember hearing it before. They will not be able to name it, or say who sang it, or explain why their chest has just changed. But they will know it, in the only way that still works, which is from the inside, without words, the way you know how to walk. And somebody in that room will see their face change, and understand that they are not alone in there after all. That scene is playing tonight in an enormous number of rooms, in every country, and it has been playing for as long as there have been people old enough to lose their memories, and other people willing to sit with them. What is new is only that we now know why it works, which changes nothing about the moment, and changes a great deal about whether anyone bothers to try it. For most of history there was no reason to think a song would reach further than a photograph or a name. People discovered it by accident, at bedsides, and had no way to pass the discovery on except as a family story. Now it can be done deliberately. That is the entire practical gift of the science here, not a cure, not a restoration, but the knowledge that a particular door exists and roughly where to find the key, so that a person sitting beside someone unreachable has one more thing to try, and the thing to try costs nothing. You have one of those songs. Everyone does. It went in during a particular handful of years, without your permission, while you were busy becoming a person, and it has been in you ever since. Occupying tissue you did not know you had allocated. It will still be there when a great many other things are not. You could probably identify it now if you sat with the question for a minute, and there is a good chance the identification would come with a small, unexpected disturbance, because the song is doing what songs do the moment you turn toward it. Notice, if you do that, how completely it is available. No effort, no searching, no gaps. It has been maintained at no cost to you, without a single act of rehearsal, through every move you have made and every version of yourself you have been since. It survived the periods you would rather forget. It survived the loss of the people you first heard it with. Whatever system is responsible for that has been running quietly underneath your life for decades, doing something no filing system would do, keeping the material that mattered to a person you no longer entirely are. It will still be there when a great many other things are not. And if it happens to you, if you end up in a room at the end with almost everything taken, it is what will still be reachable, and someone who loves you will use it to find you, and they will not need you to know their name in order to sit with you while it plays. So do not be embarrassed by what moves you, not by the songs you would not defend in company, not by the ones that seem beneath your current taste, not by the fact that something written for teenagers 40 years ago can still take the ground out from under you in a supermarket. It was not a choice, and it is not a matter of taste. It is the shape of your own foundations, showing through, and do not measure a person by what they can tell you, not your parent in that chair, and not yourself on the days when you cannot produce anything impressive. Facts are the surface layer in everyone, and they were never the part that mattered. Underneath In the last room, in every human being, there is something that was there before the facts arrived, and is still there after they have gone, and it does not need a name. Play the song. Sit with them. That is what a person is.